Well, hey there, folks. I'm Chuck Ellis. I'm the marketing director, the director of digital marketing, I should say, here at AmSpec Group. I'm really excited to have you here for a new series that we're calling AmSpec Academy, where we do educational sessions about everything from business assurance and sustainability to various different types of certification, inspections, et cetera. So thank you for joining us for this session. I'm really excited to kick things off. I do want to give some quick housekeeping notes. Yes, there will be a recording of the webinar made available to you later this week once everything has been put together and edited. So yes, you will be receiving a email in your inbox, the same email that the registration link was sent to. Will receive an invite to view a page that will have the recording on it. That will include PDF versions of the slides, as well as some additional information that should be helpful to you regarding this session. So keep an eye out for that later in the week, and we'll be excited to get that to you. If you have any questions, the chat has been turned off, but we have a section up at the top of your screen. You should see a little button that says Q&A. And if you jump in there, you can put in your questions at any time. We will be addressing those at the end of the recording. So, if you see us continuing on with the presentation, don't worry. We do see your question. We will be getting to it at the end of the session. And if we don't get to it for whatever reason, we will have your email and a copy of your question, and we will be able to reach out to you following the recording and answer your question in full then. So that's the basics to the webinar. We really appreciate you being here. We're excited to do a lot more of these. So make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. You'll see announcements of future events coming that way. And we will be having a newsletter coming out very soon that will be continuing to document these. So keep an eye out on amspecgroup.com for that as well in our resources section. So with that, I'm very excited to turn things over to our EVP of Business Assurance and Sustainability. Dr. Gillian Dagan is going to be doing this session, and I will let her take things from here. So thank you, Gil.
Thanks, Chuck. Welcome, everybody. As Chuck said, my name is Gillian Dagan. I've been with AmSpec for a couple of years now, and I head up our Business Assurance and Sustainability team. Under that umbrella, we have a number of different functions like carbon accounting, EU, DR, so deforestation regulation support, and also our certifying body. So today we'll be talking about ISCC essentials. Just before we start, I'll give you a little bit of background on AmSpec. AmSpec is a global testing, inspection, and certification firm. We work primarily in energy and chemical and agricultural commodity markets. But as you can imagine, with doing consultancy and certification, we can also work in other types of industries as well. So we could work in different fuel pathways, textiles, I said deforestation already. So a big variety of things, but all related to climate positivity. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. In this webinar, we are going to be covering kind of all of the background with ISCC. So how was the standard developed? What regulations does it support? What are the principles covered in the certification? How does it work as a voluntary scheme in supporting certain regulatory standards? And then we'll talk a little bit about implementation. So what does it look like to start your process to become ISCC certified? We also have webinars going on tomorrow, one in Spanish and one in English, that will go into a lot more detail of the actual implementation and types of mass balance and a lot more of the technical aspects of the certification itself. So today is a good foundational background, and then tomorrow we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the certification itself. So ISCC is an acronym that stands for International Sustainability and Carbon Certification. And this is an independent, multi-stakeholder certification system that supports sustainable, traceable, deforestation-free, climate-friendly supply chains. As we go through, we'll talk about what types of supply chains and what types of actions we see in those supply chains. But overall, certification under the ISCC scheme focuses on sustainable sourcing, making sure that the raw materials and the processes that are used throughout the supply chain are environmentally friendly, adhere to social welfare standards, and make sure that they limit greenhouse gas emissions. The system is built on credibility and integrity. And we talk a lot about, having an audit, gaining that ISCC certification. Well, it's not just about that last third-party audit. It's actually a complete management system development, including your own self-audits, your own, declarations about your supply chain, and then being able to track and trace all the incoming flows and outgoing flows. And all of that under your management system is really what you're going to show to an auditor and be judged on to get that certification at the end. ISCC has been around since 2010, and it came into being really to support the EU Renewable Energy Directive and the Fuel Quality Directive. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail later. If you're curious about how big the system is, currently there are 14,300 plus certifications out there, over 134 countries, and there are 68 cooperating certification bodies, AmSpec being one of those certification bodies. When we're talking about, the premise of examining someone's supply chain for sustainability, it's really about transparency and traceability. So ensuring that there's a clear chain of custody from the self-declaration that may be at the beginning of your supply chain all the way through to the end product. And in investigating and certifying that supply chain, what ISCC gives the benefit of is tradability. So being able to be traded in that European market under the Renewable Fuels Directive. Different concepts that are supported in the ISCC scheme would be obviously environmental and social standards. So I mentioned those already. Really that this is a global application. We talk about ISCC in relation to most often the European Union's fuel directives. However, it actually is accepted in a number of different countries. So it really is a global application. And many of the examples that I might talk about today will be about biofuels or circular economy, kind of alternative feedstocks for fuels. But really the ISCC certification spans even into agricultural commodities, into food and feed, and industrial products as well. Within the certifying of these supply chains, deforestation is also a policy that zero deforestation is a policy that ISCC adheres to. And then really promoting a circular economy. So the use of recycled materials and waste is one of the very strong tenets that you see under ISCC. If we're thinking about market coverage, I did mention that this goes past really just fuels, if we think about the Renewable Energy Directive. So bioenergy, plastics, food, feed, chemicals, and then aviation fuel as well. We see that a huge variety under ISCC. As I said before, EU has mandatory sustainability requirements for biofuels, bioliquids, and biomass in the EU. So again, the reason that ISCC is needed is to maintain that tradability of those products in that market. Under aviation, we have a similar situation where ICAO has mandatory requirements for sustainable aviation fuels under CORSIA. And so when we start talking about ISCC, we may say ISCC EU, we may say ISCC Plus, and then you might also hear the term ISCC CORSIA, and that's specific to aviation fuel. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what each one of those ISCC programs, what it has within it. Even in non-regulated markets, so fuel, biomass, all of that being regulated, it makes sense you would have kind of this needed scheme for certification. But even in non-regulated markets, we do see that people want an independent third-party scheme that talks about sustainability standards. So fair trade, in the feed market, we see FEFAC, and then there are similar applications within industrial and like chemical manufacturing. If we look at, the way the scheme is set up, I mentioned, there are 3 certification systems, so EU, Plus, and CORSIA, but really all of this is based on a harmonized framework. So let's say maybe within your supply chain, you want to go for, agricultural product that will be an alternative feedstock, but you also have agricultural product that may go into feed. Because this is based on the ISCC harmonized framework, you can then combine those audits. So it's built to be a very client-friendly, efficient way to certify multiple parts of your supply chain, even when you have more variety within one given supply chain. Again, talking about market coverage, just to give some examples. So under agricultural and forestry feedstocks, you see there's a variety of different crops, but not only are we looking at agricultural commodities, again, that tenet about the use of waste products, recycled material, you'll see that there's a massive amount of used cooking oil that's ISCC certified, recycled plastics that are now alternative feedstocks for fuels, landfill gas. So there's a vast variety of products that fall under the ISCC certification scheme. When we're looking at the principles that ISCC covers, we call it a sustainability scheme, but very specifically, there are 6 principles. Principle 1, protection of land with high biodiversity. Principle 2, looking at protecting soil, water, and air. Principle 3 really speaks to the social welfare aspect about safe working conditions. Principle 4, compliance with human labor rights and responsible community relations. So that goes well with Principle 3 to bring in social welfare. And then Principle 5, compliance with land rights, laws, and international treaties. And then 6, good management practices and continuous improvement. And if you've been through any type of certification, Principle 6 is included in all of them. So good record keeping and the ability to evaluate and improve your own management system. When we're looking at ISCC, one of the good things is there is cross compliance. So just as I had said that within the harmonized framework, you can get multiple audits done at once. ISCC ensures that not only can you show sustainability across your supply chain, but you should be able to use it to qualify for other national or international regulations as well. If we're looking at farms that are ISCC certified, Principle 1 is a non-negotiable. So they have to be audited for Principle 1, and then they can actually be working towards Principles 2 through 6. In the EU, this often overlaps with common agricultural policy, where farmers have to follow cross-compliance rules to receive subsidies. So again, it's kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, going under the ISCC certification, and then also being able to qualify under the CAP. Additional requirements. So if we look at something like biomass, treated a little bit different, it has to be in full compliance with all 6 principles. Partial compliance is not allowed. You also see that there are certain ways to look at what you consider a farm and what you would actually have to include within the audit for certification. So cherry picking is not allowed. You have to include the entire farm or the entire plantation, not just selected fields. Also, land use change is taken into account when we're looking at the ISCC rules. So if there is a land use change that goes away from sustainable practices, certification is not going to be possible. Also wanted to point out in here that, in the EU member states, when we talked about the cross-compliance, farms that are already complying with cross-compliance and are audited for Principle 1 under ISCC, we also say, and any gaps covered by EU law. So that really brings in kind of the rest of the principles there. And then a continuous improvement plan has to be in place for farms to achieve full compliance over time. When we're looking at our supply chain, there are a variety of operations and activities that would be certified during the supply chain. So you may start with a farm or a plantation if you're talking about an agricultural feedstock, or a point of origin. So if you think about used cooking oil being collected from a variety of different restaurants, those would be the different points of origin. So those are kind of the beginning of the supply chains. Depending on which you're working with, you would then kind of bring raw materials together at a first gathering point or at a collection point. And then ISCC would be looking at your supply chain from there through processing of the products, through trader and storage, and all the way to market. So when someone starts their ISCC certification journey, really it's about which parts of that supply chain do you touch. It might be the entire supply chain, or if you're, let's say, a trader, you may only be holding a certificate that's valid for that last point. We decided to include just kind of a list of the abbreviations and then a link to what all the scope of abbreviations are under the scheme. We just felt like this is just useful to have on hand. So when you get your recording of the webinar, we'll also be sharing the slides. So you'll have these links and kind of this to just keep on hand so you can understand what all of the different abbreviations are. All right, so let's talk about what a voluntary scheme is. So ISCC is a voluntary scheme, but there are a number of EU-approved voluntary and national certification schemes. Many of these are very similar, covering biofuels, covering biomass, renewable hydrogen, and all types of recycled carbon fuels, and all of them have to do with sustainability. So overall, all of the voluntary schemes are trying to, again, maintain high biodiversity and carbon stocks, protect land that has high biodiversity and carbon stocks, excuse me, and then really increase the amount of renewable electricity for hydrogen and make sure that across the board, they're limiting greenhouse gas emissions. To be a voluntary scheme that's approved by the EU, there's a very high bar. So currently 18 different voluntary and national certification schemes are included, and we've given a link to those here. But really, all of these include robust auditing, traceability, and compliance. And so they've undergone their own scrutiny by the EU and are thus recognized as a voluntary. You heard me mention the Renewable Energy Directive. So this is a directive within the EU that is mandating increased renewable energy use and then supports cooperation between EU countries towards this goal. It requires economic operators to arrange audits to ensure accuracy, reliability, and fraud protection within supply chains. And that's really what ISCC as a voluntary scheme supports. From AmSpec, we actually certify under all of the ISCC certification schemes. And we also, just to give you an example of another type of voluntary scheme, we also provide the SURE scheme for the EU. And this is one that's focused on biomass for fuels. So agricultural biomass, forest biomass, and waste and residues. So similar in that it is an additional voluntary scheme, just like ISCC. All right, so a little bit more detail. I mentioned there are several types of ISCC schemes available, and it really depends on what your material is and what the target market for the finished product is. So the easiest ones to understand, ISCC CORSIA and CORSIA Plus. So those are very specific to aviation fuels. If you look at ISCC EU, you're going to see a lot of bio-based feedstocks under that one. And then ISCC Plus is really about recycled circular economy, the ability to use waste and recycled materials as your starting feedstock. So they're each designed to work specifically for the supply chains using those items. All right, so ISCC EU shows compliance with RED 3 and in all EU member states. You can see that different ISCC certifications fulfill additional groups based on either, for instance, the Dutch sustainability requirements can be fulfilled, compliance with the liquid fuel supply regulation in Queensland, aviation fuels for renewable energy in Germany. So it's not just tradability within the EU, but also can qualify for a number of other requirements. Okay, legal framework. So I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here, but this just kind of gives you an idea of when we talk about renewable energy directive or fuel directives in the EU, kind of how those regulations come into effect. And so when we talk about a directive, really that's setting a goal for EU member states to achieve with their own laws. What's nice is that when we talk about ISCC, it's accepted across the entire EU, and then again, fills some of those other requirements as well. So in the RED directive, you would see that that was put into effect by the European Commission. So their putting out the directive themselves. They're also choosing the sustainability certification schemes and approving those voluntary schemes that are accepted. So ISCC being one of them, Sure scheme being one of them as part of that group. And then what we have are certifying bodies. So certification bodies, I said at the beginning, there were 68 under the ISCC scheme. Each one of those certification bodies has gone to an accreditation body, gained the appropriate ISO accreditations, and then applied with that scheme owner to be somebody that they approve to execute certification work. So AmSpec as a certification body, not only do we have to maintain our accreditations for our accreditation body, we also have to remain in good standing with the scheme owner, so with ISCC themselves. In addition, surveillance is done on our work to make sure that we're still functioning correctly as a certification body. Therefore, when we go out, we certify a supply chain, then that audit and certification goes to the client, and then they can trade within the EU. So it's a very robust set of kind of checks and balances, not only on the traders and the producers of biofuels, but also on us as a certification body ourselves. All right. So again, a little bit, regulations were put out first by the EU Commission to build up to come down to the most recent Renewable Energy Directive 3. And really the biggest changes from 2 to 3 was further accelerating the deploying renewable energy. And we'll get into a couple of details on that in just a second. Again, that regulation that backs up the Renewable Energy Directive, highly focused on verification of sustainability, limiting greenhouse gas emissions, and the framework outlines kind of detailed standards for voluntary certification systems. So again, this is coming out of EU government regulations into a directive that has to be implemented. And then these voluntary schemes are backing up that directive. Under the newest version, the RED 3, we see even higher goals for implementation of renewable energy. So setting a target of 42.5% for overall energy consumption, renewable energy consumption by 2030, with an aspirational goal of 45%. We see revised targets for renewable fuels from non-biological origin. And then really, not only do we see accelerating the deployment of renewables, but the ability to even increase that rate of change as time goes on. And I've talked a lot about Renewable Energy Directive. I did mention Fuel Quality Directive. So while we have Renewable Energy Directive that's kind of establishing the overall targets for renewable energy use, the Fuel Quality Directive specifically focuses on reducing the carbon intensity of fuels. It sets specifications for road transport fuels to decrease emissions, and then sets binding targets for the reduction of greenhouse gases as well. So again, this kind of is a good illustration of what I was describing earlier. So really, European Union, European Commission, creating those directives that have a certain set of goals, how that is transposed to the member states. The member states are able to recognize and monitor certification bodies that support the RED 3. And then really that's how all of those voluntary schemes support the directives, but work across all of the member states. All right, so you may hear people mention Annex 9. Annex 9 is a listing of materials that are eligible for ISCC EU certification. So these would be different types of feedstocks, and in Annex 9, that's where you would go to look to see exactly what can be included under the scheme. Main challenges for defining practical certification guidance: intermediate crops have been one that has been questionable. And then how do we handle severely degraded land? So really, Annex 9 helps establish, or should help establish, clear, measurable thresholds for what is the definition of degraded land. We expect more guidance to be coming from the EU Commission on these. So we'll have much more, I would say, specific definitions going forward. We wanted to include this comparative analysis between RED 2 and RED 3. I'm not going to read you the table, but I've covered a lot of this with the RED 3 advancements in heightening the renewable fuel or renewable energy usage, and really ramping up those goals even faster, I think this is just a useful table to keep on hand to kind of understand the changes. All right, so you'll hear the term renewable fuels of non-biological origin. These are renewable fuels derived from non-biological sources. So this could be green hydrogen via electrolysis. This could be different synthetic fuels like e-methanol, e-kerosene, or green ammonia. Specifically, RED 3 targets that by 2030, 42% of hydrogen used must be from RFN bios. And then in 2035, that share increases to 60%. To support, again, these targets that the directive has put forward, ISCC has developed, very robust certification specifically for renewable fuels of non-biologic origin. And I think that's really important to point out. All right. So, we talk about the voluntary schemes are here to support the different directives. And really, the union database is how all of this information kind of closes that feedback loop and then is fed into the EU's hands. So looking at the traceability of different feedstocks, the traceability of different fuels, the union database is where economic operators are required to register their origin and their transactions to ensure integrity. So if you think about the amount of used cooking oil, let's say coming out of a certain country, looking at the mass balance of how much used cooking oil you started with and how much biofuels created at the end, that's really what the union database is here for, is to kind of catch any type of fraud from becoming pervasive within the system. As an economic operator in this, people are going to be required to create an account, upload their different supply chains and their mass balances. I think there's a lot of trepidation about this, but the good news is there are excellent systems out there, software systems that can help operators tie directly into the union database. If you'd like to look at a good example of one, I would suggest Veriflux, where you're tracking all of your inflows and all of your outflows, and then reporting into the UDB is seamless at the end. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ISCC implementation. And again, we have the second part of this webinar tomorrow that's going to get into a lot more detail. But just in general, what does the certification process look like? So within the certification process, the process itself, the documents therein, these are all controlled documents from a certification body that have been part of our approval process with the scheme owner, with ISCC directly. So signing a contract with a service provider like AmSpec would be the first step in working towards an ISCC certification. Second step, after that work order is signed, you would be registering in the hub. And the hub is an online database that ISCC runs. So really kind of filling out your form, registering within the scheme, then getting time on the calendar with your auditor. Now, before the audit happens, if you're already ISCC certified and you've gone through the process in years past, then you know what to expect when your auditor comes and you go through the process. However, if it is your first time trying to gain an ISCC certification, or maybe you've always had ISCC EU, but you've never done ISCC Corsia, you have a little bit more work to do to prepare for the audit. Now, a lot of people will elect to hire a consultant to help them set up these management systems and have all of their paperwork in order, all of their I's dotted and their T's crossed by the time the auditor shows up. That consultancy service is absolutely not mandatory, but if it's your first time, we highly recommend getting help to set up your processes, set up your management system so you're ready and you understand exactly what's going to be asked of you during the audit and you feel very comfortable answering those questions. So once your management system is in place, you have all of your traceability records, you're able to show training records, then you're ready for your audit. The auditor comes on site. These are not remote audits. They actually have to come on site. And depending on the complexity of your supply chain, this could take between 1 or maybe 2 or 3 days to complete the audit. Once the auditor has gathered all of their information, they put a report together. It goes to the certifying body's technical committee for review. That technical committee reviews all of the auditor's notes, and then determines if there are nonconformities that need to be corrected, or if that supply chain is appropriate to certify under the scheme of choice at that point. All right, so I kind of already covered this. What would consultancy cover? Really, it's helping you set up and get ready for that audit. I think the important thing on this slide to note is there is a strict separation between auditing and consulting. So as you can imagine, we couldn't have the same person being paid to advise you on how to set up your system and then also coming back in and auditing you as well. So to avoid a conflict of interest, those two functions, consultancy and auditing, really do need to be separate, and definitely by different service providers, to make sure that there's no conflict of interest there. And then really within the audit, it's a lot about documentation. So something kind of broad to think about: written commitment by management that they're going to comply with ISCC requirements. So broad, declarative statement saying that management is on board, and then really showing that you put together a management system and you're using it. So conducting of internal audits at least once a year, and then that you're doing adequate training for employees that are going to be working under the scheme. So being able to show an auditor a training plan, what's in the curriculum, where are the training records for different individuals, that these would be things that you should be expected to provide during an audit. And then really showing all of that traceability data for your supply chain. So how are you organized? How are you keeping track of internal material flows and outgoing product on the other end? Looking at your mass balance. I'll mention mass balance today, but tomorrow there will be a lot more detail on how that mass balance works and really how you're calculating your greenhouse gas emissions within your supply chain. Also, data on what are your control points, what type of conversion factors are you using, and then how can you show that your stock keeping is accurate and well logged, and then really being able to link between products, product flow, and documentation. So this is all about traceability from the beginning to the end of the supply chain. All right. So if there are questions, I'm happy to take those now. And again, today's webinar is really about background. Tomorrow, we will go into detail on mass balance, some of the different greenhouse gas calculations. We'll get into a lot more of the technical aspects. Give you guys just a second to enter any questions you might have.
Gillian, I have a question. What are the most common nonconformities found during ISCC audit?
Rodrigo, we have one of our lead auditors on here, so I will let Rodrigo kind of share some of the things he's seen in the field.
Of course. Thank you. How was everyone doing? So most usual nonconformities on the ISCC system are related to reported quantities. So ISCC, because of the European Commission, of course, mandates that every system user needs to report the quantities that were handled during the last calendar year. And usually that reporting tends to have several different mistakes. Some could be related to reporting systems of the company itself that perhaps have some mismatch with after review delivery documentation, for an example, or that reporting can also be dependent on the scope of the system user that's reporting the quantities. Therefore, there are a few differences. For example, if a point of origin declares the quantities or a collecting point does so. So I would say that's the most usual nonconformity that we find. And then we could mention a couple others that are just regular minor nonconformities. For example, some document that's not correctly dated, perhaps an official document that's not properly signed. Other more major nonconformities, which could potentially also be considered as critical, could be some kind of mismatch between quantities in relation to the reporting system of a company, and of course the sustainability documentation of said batch of material. Perhaps something related also to the GAG information of the batch itself. And again, some kind of mismatch between the reporting system and the information of a lot that we could be considering. I would say most of the regular nonconformities are gathered in some of those groups that I mentioned.
Thanks. Good question, Chuck.
Thank you. We got a few pre-asked ones that I'm going to go through while other people in the audience are typing in their questions. What role do independent GHG verifiers play alongside ISCC auditors in ensuring methodological consistency?
I'm free to take that one as well, if you don't mind, Gil.
Sure.
So basically, an independent GHG reviewer from an ICC audit procedure, they are the responsibles of reviewing the methodology and also validating the calculations for the audited period. The qualification for an independent GHG reviewer from a technical side, it's a bit more specific than perhaps a general lead auditor. And therefore, we need proper training as well as ICC trainings with official certificates from the courses to be able to provide that service.
Thank you. Let's see. Are there specific audit adaptations for countries transitioning from voluntary to mandatory sustainability frameworks?
Chuck, can you repeat that one? I'm sorry.
Sure. Are there specific audit adaptations for countries transitioning from voluntary to mandatory sustainability frameworks?
Rodrigo, do you want to weigh in on that one? If
Sure.
not, we can always follow up afterwards as well.
Now, there are a couple good examples that I think we can mention on that regard. So basically, ICC and of course other voluntary systems are voluntary, but majorly demanded and depending on the market that they're being certified for. So there are some examples of national organizations getting in contact, for example, with ISCC to develop a system that specifically applies for their legal framework and their regulatory framework. And that's an example of the Canadian CFR, for example, that it's under development as of now. And they are basically a transitioning between a voluntary scheme that has been applied in Canada before, moving into a more mandated system that they need to report the sustainability aspects of the materials handled in the country too. Therefore, I think it's a bit of what you were mentioning, Chuck, basically an example of a transition between voluntary and mandatory regulations and systems.
All right, great. Let's see, we still got some time for more questions. Anybody in the audience wants to put some in, you can put them in the Q&As. Don't go too far, Rodrigo. I think we got another one here for you. How are remote audits being standardized post-COVID, and when will hybrid or continuous assessment models become official under ISCC?
That is a great question. Remote audits are not regular procedure for ISCC. Unfortunately, remote audits can only be conducted under very specific conditions. During COVID, we, of course, went under a period where we had to conduct the audits remotely with a couple additional requirements, let's say. But since then, we are not allowed to perform remote audits for any case that we desire. We have had cases where we specifically solicited approval from ICC, for example, for conducting remote audits and were explicitly denied, given that it's not ICC necessarily who needs to approve these kind of procedures, but rather the European Commission under very specific circumstances. Remote audits, for example, can be conducted for paper trader scopes for surveillance audits. Just to give you an example, basically any kind of audit that has a level of assurance that it's compatible with the ICC requirements, even though we're not assisting on-site to the location. Unfortunately, as of now, we cannot and are not allowed to conduct any remote audits other than, I think, the example I just mentioned.
All right. Thank you, Rodrigo. Those are all the ones I have from people who sent email questions. And again, folks, if you have questions, you can always email them to our presenters directly, and you can join us tomorrow for our live session where we will be doing more Q&A during that time. And if you've got something that comes up between now and then, please feel free to email me at chuck.ellis@amspecgroup.com or gillian.dagan@amspecgroup.com. Or you can drop or take Rodrigo a message. Rodrigo, is your AmSpec Group email functioning properly, or do we need to give them the other email?
It is functioning properly and receiving questions, so no worries.
Excellent. So yeah, that's just rodrigo.otero@amspecgroup.com. So pretty easy to remember.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone who attended today. I hope you get a chance to attend tomorrow as well and get into the technical details. And thanks for spending time with us today.